Hello and welcome everyone to this Zepto Connect Unpacked, the latest payments trends from around the globe, virtual fireside chat. I'm Ben Alcock, I'm brand and content manager at Zepto and your host for this morning. So today from my home in Bangalore in the northern Rivers region of New South Wales, which is just a stone's throw from Zepto's Byron Bay birthplace. Both Bangalore and Byron sit in Arakwal country, which was home to the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation for some 22,000 years. And I acknowledge the Arakwal people as traditional custodians of these lands. If you know the area, you'll know that Arakwal country runs from 7 Mile Beach, south of Broken Head, up to the Brunswick River north, out to the escarpment west of Byron Bay, which is where I am, and then out into the sparkling waters of the Tasman Sea that lap the Cape of Byron and its beaches. It's a really beautiful, wonderful, unlikely place from which to build a world-class payments infrastructure company. We launched these Zepto Connect webinars in May this year. This is the 7th in the series. If you're curious about those, you can find replays of previous sessions over on the Zepto Payments YouTube channel. Zepto Connect is a space we've created to curate engaging conversations with really clever people about our favorite things, including technology, innovation, brilliant businesses, trends, predictions, payments, and a future shaped by all of those things. And today we're delighted to have coordinated some panelists' calendars across time zones and datelines even in the latest installment, but more on that in a second. First up, a little bit of housekeeping. So Zepto Connect events are enhanced. They're always better by audience engagement and participation. So we'd love to hear from you throughout the session. How you do that is you'll see some icons towards the top of your screen. There's a chat box represented by speech icons, and you can post general comments and praise for the host in that chat box. Below that, you'll see a Q&A icon where you can post questions that you'd like me to ask the panel. We'll monitor that feed during the course of the conversation, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Bit of a pro tip: if you think someone has asked a really, really good question and you want to boost its chances of being answered, just upvote it by clicking the up arrow beneath the specific question. So feel free at any time to start populating that with your questions. But remember, for best results, keep questions in the Q&A channel, comments, shout outs, and emojis in the chat channel, please. Now it's time to meet the talent. This year, our expert panelists have crisscrossed the planet, attending conferences and consequential gatherings. And today we plan to tease out what had them leaning in and unpack their key learnings and insights. So first up, joining us from Bentonville in Arkansas in the US is Reed Luttanen. Reed is Executive Director and CEO of the US Faster Payments Council, which is an industry-led membership organization whose mission is to facilitate a world-class payment system where Americans can safely and securely pay anyone, anywhere, anytime. It also produces the popular Off the Rails podcast. And not too long ago, Reed had Chris and Trevor from Zepto on that podcast. Reed manages the organisation's daily operations and works with its board and membership to execute its strategic plan while ensuring effective and transparent dialogue with all stakeholders. Welcome, Reed.
All right, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
And joining us from Brisbane, Simone Joyce. Simone is Global CEO and co-founder of Paypa. Founded in 2018, Paypa counts Australia's largest banks and global brand MasterCard among its shareholders. Paypa has been instrumental in driving its banking client adoption and commercialisation of Australia's real-time request. Positioned to do the same for clients in the US now. Simone lives in New York with her husband and children, but I think you can see from the view at the moment, she's coming in hot from Brisbane.
I am. Thank you, Ben. Pleasure to be here.
And joining us from Byron Bay is Jewell. So Chris is CEO and co-founder of Zepto. Before joining Zepto, Chris spent the better part of 2 decades working in investment banking and financial markets in London, Melbourne, and Sydney for the likes of Goldman Sachs, Credit Suisse, and Citi in sales and leadership roles. Under his leadership, Zepto has transformed from a relatively simple fintech to a world-class payments infrastructure technology company, processing more than 80 million transactions annually. In 2023, this was an outstanding business leader finalist at the New South Wales Business Awards and presented on a payments panel at the inaugural South by Southwest event. And I'm delighted to say he's making his Zepto Connect debut today. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, I'm excited for this morning. And Reid, Simone, I'm great to connect again. Yeah, let's get into it.
So with these three rockstar speakers on the panel today, my job should be pretty easy. Really just get the conversation started and keep an eye on the clock. We're scheduled to wrap up at about 8:45, but if the chat is really good, we may go a little bit longer. So let's get started. I'm going to kick off just with a really simple icebreaker for the panel. It's the same question to all of you. I'd love to know, as a kid, what was the very first thing you ever bought with your own money? So I'll go first. It was like a Matchbox car or a Hot Wheels car. I had like $1 or $1.10 from my grandmother, and I remember it being a really, really hard decision, knowing precisely which car to hand the cash over for. Reid, how about you?
Oh, it's funny. I can't necessarily say this is literally the first thing, but the first memory I have is I saved my money up and bought a baseball bat. So I was a big baseball player as a kid. My son now is. So I'll probably always remember the bat even if I don't have it anymore.
Nice. Simone?
I'm just trying to think. I can't remember the first thing that I purchased. I do remember the first music thing I saved up for, though, a Bananarama cassette tape. I was desperate for this, Love in the First Degree, and I think I'd still listen to that today. I might get it on Spotify. I think now I'm reminiscing about it.
Yeah, had a cassette.
Did you also buy a pencil to rewind the tape?
Oh, I had plenty of them. I'm pretty sure I had one of those tape decks where you could play record and record like the radio, which probably is illegal, come to think of it, looking back.
And how about you, Chris?
This is a true story, actually. My dad owned an independent toy store, would you believe? This is before Toys R Us and everything. So, yeah, I was a prolific spender of my pocket money. Had a great He-Man collection, which was those figurines from back in the day. So, yeah, but I was pretty spoiled. Only child as well. So, the combination toy store, only child, it all played out well for me.
Living the dream.
Like a movie childhood. Hey, Reid, I might kick off with you, sort of take a kind of US centric view to begin with. Despite real-time payment networks really taking off in jurisdictions all around the world, even in your neck of the woods in Brazil with Pix, elsewhere in India with the UPI network and Australia's NPP, to name a few, it seems like real-time payments perhaps were a bit of a blind spot in the US until relatively recently. Is that a fair description? And can you share with us where FedNow is and real-time payments are currently in the US?
Yeah, I think that is fair to say that we're definitely behind, right? Lots of jurisdictions, including Australia, have got off the dime a little quicker than the US did. That said, we do have now, I guess if you're going to be late, you might as well overdo it. So instead of just doing one network, we went ahead and did two. And so we've got, of course, I'll start with RTP because it's sort of the older of the two. It's been around for about 6 years now. They're up to about 400 financial institutions. Now, just to be clear, in the United States, 400 is a very small fraction of the total number of financial institutions. There's about 9,000 financial institutions in the United States, but those 400 make up somewhere between 65 and 70% of the DDA accounts in the United States. So they've got pretty solid reach, for being where they are in their growth. They're also showing good, steady quarter-over-quarter growth in transaction volumes and dollars transacted. It was noted over the last few months they had the first day where they had over 1 million transactions in a day, and they've passed the $500 million total transaction mark. So. And I think a lot of people expect that to sort of just continue to accelerate. So that's it's a good story if it's sort of like a late story compared to other markets. FedNow, of course, is the other instant payment system here in the U.S., and we have to have a name that is generic because we have two of them. They launched over the summer. It's been a long time coming again, but up to about 200 or so financial institutions on that network now. And continuing to see good growth in terms of financial institutions adopting it. I think generally speaking, FIs here have had lots of options in terms of different payment rails that they've had access to and different ways to move the money on behalf of their customers. And at the same time, customers have been served by alternative financial services providers, the digital wallets and such, that give that feel of instantaneous payment, even though those of us who are nerds about it understand that that's not really what's going on. So, I think that being said, I think that there's clearly, and we're going to get into this, I don't want to sort of steal everybody's thunder, but we're going to get into lots of different ways that this new technology opens up innovation. I think people are starting to get wise to that here. And
I would just add to that as well, that's important, like from framing the context of where we're going today, is that I was saying to someone the other day, like ACH in the US and BEX in Australia, these are like Hall of Fame payment infrastructure systems, right? They've been reliable, they've been scalable, they've had, great cost benefit. And so, it's equally hard because we're coming from a world over the last 50 years where that payment infrastructure has been able to power and enable and innovate in a world and it's done incredibly well, right? And so we're at this point now where we've got this crossover, and whether it's a blind spot or not, I think the main thing that, at least from what I'm seeing and read, at the Faster Payment Council meetings that we see, the interest and the discussion and the panels are starting to really index towards we're now going to a world that's an on-demand digital world and digital economy, where this world that we're coming from, that's had this Hall of Fame payment infrastructure to support us, can't enable these big merchants, in our case, the ability to differentiate their product or service through payment innovation, absent of a real-time payment ecosystem to help drive that. And I think that point of where we're at is a really important point to recognize. And I do think that the challenge will be like transition from the old world to the new world as much as it is understanding the new world.
I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say to your point, Reed, about having all these different optionalities in the States. I'm seeing that there's a real, there's almost a friction as use cases that you just brought up, Chris, are coming to the surface, because there's so many other options that are taking the place in the States. And, BEX, we've got one flavor, ACH, same day, and BEX slow. So there's almost a lot of, if you're at the ice cream shop, there's so many different choices you can make. And then to your point around wallets and other services, Zelle and Venmo, they're not being used for appropriate purposes when businesses are using them for payments. But I pay my young man's nursery school fees every month on Zelle, and I hate it. But that's a really hard thing to have to shift not just the core understanding of the industry and infrastructure. And there's a lot of, different voices there around how far people along the understanding of what real-time payments can truly bring. But you've got this huge, long population of people that, as far as they're concerned, nothing's broken yet. So, yeah, it's super interesting.
Hey, Reed, is it not $9 trillion of checks, value of checks still in circulation annually in the US, which is crazy? That's probably right. So I think we talk a lot about what payment types are going to be disrupted the most by instant payments. And everybody, I think, instinctively asks the question about ACH. And my first answer is, come on, we don't need to worry about ACH when I was at Walmart 5 years ago, we took 100 million checks at the point of sale in 1 year. Like there's real check at the point of sale. Now they're converted to ACH at the point of sale, but somebody stood there and wrote a check in the store. So that there's a huge amount of checks still being pushed around. And I mean, that's not only is it like slow and cumbersome, but it's also just a huge fraud problem, right? We're seeing huge growth in check fraud here in the United States. And, think about like handing around paper with your account number and routing number just on it. Like that's like just a recipe for disaster.
What do you think needs to happen to get rid of checks? Do you think it's a combination of, sorry, Ben, I just stole your question. do you think it's a combination of having the appropriateness of a replacement service like RTP said now, but is that going to come from institutions saying, hey, this is costing us a lot of money, particularly supporting all of the fraud investigations, we are ceasing service? Or is that an impossibility? Do you think that, like in Australia, the government will step in and go, guys, enough's enough, checks are reaching their end of life? Or do you think it's going to have to wait, like a lot of things do, for consumer preference to drive the investment in changing away from checks?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're asking me, I I think it's going to be largely driven by shifting consumer interest and demand. Now, that said, that will never get you to the actual extinction of anything, right? And I look at in the card as an example of that, right? So we had for a long time magnetic stripe, and then the backup was to hand key the card number. Well, then they put the chips on the card, but they still expected you to run the mag stripe as the backup, but then also be able to hand key as a second backup. Right now we're getting to the point where that second backup is starting to, nobody's using it anymore. So now the card companies are starting to say, hey, you don't have to hand key cards anymore as long as you can take chip or a mag stripe. So I think we're getting to that. I think that's how you get to the end of it, right? Is like eventually you get to just critical mass. And it's like, this is just a hassle that we don't want to even allow anymore. But I think mostly it'll be shifting consumer expectations and interests away from that sort of thing. That's at least how I see it. Like, I don't know, Chris, if you disagree.
Well, I was just going to say, like, between Venmo, Cash App, and Zelle, those three things, people's awareness of what's possible and the expectations around instant settlement, instant messaging, instant satisfaction, if we want to say that, between each other is there, probably as good as it is in any country around the world. And now they're thinking about, how do I take that experience and why can't I have that with my rent or my school fees, or like, why does it have to come back to a more analog way when we are operating in such a digital way on one side of the ledger? And I think that is actually going to help drive awareness and adoption. And Reed, we were at the conference a couple months ago, and I bumped into, I forget the fintech's name, but Jonathan Sherry at Guidehouse introduced me, and it was about, like, they're building a real-time payment fintech just to fix bond payments on property, or the prepayment of a bond, which usually has to go through a check. They're building an entire business in this very niche vertical, and it's incredibly large. So, unlike Australia, where these verticals aren't that big to sustain innovation in themselves, collectively, I think there is great opportunity. The opportunity in the US is on such a scale. If you get it right, even with a very narrow use case, it can have an incredible impact that extends. And I think that's been really interesting for me to see over the last couple of years, just even the engagement through the Faster Payments Council of the fintech community and what they bring.
That actually reminds me of another thing that I think is a sort of an impediment to getting rid of checks right now and sort of advancing the cause of instant and faster payments. And there are various use cases, and actually real estate is among them in some state, where checks are like defined in statutes as being required as the form of payment, or an acceptable form. It's checks or cash in some cases. And that's, alcohol deliveries. There's lots of different use cases where there's like statutory requirements that we have to sort of clean up, right? Because those statutes were written, 100 years ago or something, when there was nothing but checks and cash. So I think that's another piece of it too. But I will say that generationally, like, if you talk to anybody who's younger than about 80, if you mention checks, they're like, "Oh, I never write checks." So like, it's not cool anymore. That's for sure.
We also had checks in our legislation in Australia. It was, I think, 36, potentially off the top of my head, different mentions of checks as a defined payment method, which obviously has to be unwrapped. Much more complicated to do that across every single state in the US, though.
Amazing. Hey, Reed, I've heard you say before that payments only happen because there's a relationship that already exists between two people or two entities, and that there's always something going on behind or beyond the payment itself. And to me, that something going on feels like a use case or a business type or a business model. My experience has been that articulating use cases is key to understanding the opportunity and potential of real-time payments. What real-time payments use cases are you seeing develop in the US, perhaps even from the Faster Payment Council members that are helping to drive adoption, or even just conversations about adoption in the US?
Yeah, I would hope that these aren't that much different, but maybe more limited at this point than what you guys are experiencing. I think the big ones you keep hearing about are what I would classify as a disbursement type transaction. So a lot of payroll or gig economy worker pay. So you think about Ubers and Grubhub, Uber Eats, things like that, or Uber. paying the drivers for their deliveries and instantly. Even more formal payroll, we're seeing more and more usage, right? So maybe hourly shift workers being paid instantly at the end of the day is a growing use case that we're seeing here to sort of bolster that type of payment. We mentioned mobile wallets a number of times already. We're going to mention it again here because funding and defunding of mobile wallets is a big use case, and it's actually a big driver of revenue for those mobile wallets. It's a large part of their economic model is charging their customers for the defunding and sending money out of their wallets and back into their bank account. Some other things that we're seeing emerging and hearing success around are like loan funding. So I talked to one large auto lender, and they talked about implementing RTP to fund loans, and they began winning a significant increase in loans without changing the other terms associated with that loan. So just the ability to pay instantly was a competitive advantage that they were able to create for themselves. And then of course, the big one that's coming is the United States Treasury Department is going to be using FedNow to disperse all kinds of payments from social welfare programs, retirement payments, tax refunds, and their own payroll. And then of course, and those are all FPC members I was talking about. So you get a bonus there, but also FPC deliverable. We have a use case repository on our website where you can look at, there's about 130 different use cases that our members have been looking at and talking about. So there's lots and lots of interest for a wide variety of use cases. And I know we haven't even touched on point of sale, which I know is where Chris is.
Can I make some observations about that list? Right? It's a huge list. And as soon as that social welfare hits, that's like a massive uptick. The adoption curve will just do a cliff climb. Most of them are payouts. And I think it's really important for fintechs who are based in Australia listening to this and thinking about the US as a growth market. The two real-time payment rails are designed fundamentally differently to the way that we think about particularly Pay2 in Australia. I think the US is really where we were as an industry across 2018-19, where the payment rails were being used to send payments from one account to another. And that's good. And I actually think if we had a look at where those adoption curves were sitting, the US is probably trending higher than our initial use cases in Australia. Where we diverge in similarities is the ability to send a persistent, ongoing request for payment. So Pay2 being allowed to do that ongoing bill payment, credit payment, whatever it might be, without the payer coming to re-participate in consent. I think that's where there's a real difference, and there's no concept of an agreement or a mandate on the real-time payments in the US, and there's no recurring capability yet, which I think is really interesting because it may be holding back some use cases for wider adoption. But I also think that request for payment is probably the biggest challenge the industry faces in the US of getting that across the line. There's no mandate for any bank to support that for their payers. Therefore, we come back to that first bit about, okay, where's the industry sentiment? Are the use cases aligning with the appetite of financial institutions to support it? Because unlike Australia, we don't have direct participation in the US. Zepto is our connected institution that's not a bank in Australia, which is amazing. Can't do that in the US. So I think that there's this huge volume of use cases to pay out. Oh, cannabis payments, another one. Have you been seeing that? You can't use a card to pay for cannabis. Account to account is the only way to do it. So interesting there. Anyway.
That's massive. I met the founder of this company in the US called AeroPay, and they built their business to like over 20 million ARR on cannabis payments, which just again blew my mind in terms of that. There's a lot of good stuff in what you just said, Simone, and I think I feel like that's really important. Like in Australia, we've got a really progressive. I think we're 3 to 5 years ahead of the world in many respects, because now, as a significant merchant or enterprise, you've got the ability to use the real-time payment infrastructure to send money in real time, to receive money via an alias with confirmation of payee, which brings great value in real time. And now with Pay2, in effect, the ability to collect with the consent of a customer, be it a business or a consumer. Now that is, I think the world's watching this, by the way. I think the Federal Reserve are very aware of what we're doing, and there's no really Uber-developed real-time payment infrastructure globally yet that's got the winning formula. But I do think that Australia's in a position that is really edging forward in terms of, hey, look, if we can display and show this move from the early adopters of technology, which is great because every product, every ecosystem needs early adopters. But for this to really pay off, we need this to move into mainstream application, mainstream use cases. And the world is screaming out for those at the moment, and we haven't yet seen the tsunami of that hit. Like, I think there's a lot of large enterprise leading brands at the moment that are trying to think about this not in terms of a product that competes with cards or it's a cost saving benefit. What does this mean in terms of value to my customer and the relationship I have with my customer and the ability for me to differentiate, as I said before, the products I'm creating or the services I'm delivering through payment innovation. And I think the next 12 to 18 months in Australia can be really, really critical in seeing these use cases emerge. And we can talk about some of the challenges that may persist around that. But then I think the world, and when I say the world, like, I'm very much biased to the US and the opportunity. But I think that the US and the FPC in particular will be open, and we quite often at the FPC bring in global use cases and different rails to talk about the challenges, the wins, the uncertainty, the regulatory tailwinds and headwinds that we faced. And I think that regulators and central banks want this to work. And I actually also think that the Fed, now that they've launched FedNow with this ability to push, as you said, I do think that an alias product or functionality on the roadmap is over the next 2 years of like what is next for them in terms of extending that real-time payment capability. But we're still a ways off the ability to collect the request for pay.
Can I ask a question on that? And maybe this is one for, I don't know if you want to ruminate on, but the success of Venmo and Zelle and to some extent PayPal and Cash App has relied on that closed loop system where you just mentioned that a lot of their business model relies on charging to have that currency or that funding moved back into the real world where you can spend it. If there is an alias overlay or service introduced across real-time payments in the US, do you think that that's going to put pressure on Venmo, Zelle, PayPal, Cash App to change their business model or threaten them with a little bit of irrelevancy?
I think yes. I mean, I think there's already some pressure being applied a little, somewhat to them because they're the veil that they've created, the veneer of instantaneous payments is sort of being lifted a little bit. It's like, well, actually, we can do it for real instant. But I think getting to your point, like the other thing that gives them the value is, well, I just have to know somebody's email address or what have you. I think that's going to definitely put some pressure on them. But at the same time, for a long time, I've thought that they were a little bit short-sighted in not sort of federating those wallets anyway. Like I've always thought that would have made them a much more powerful place to actually do banking and not need to constantly be taking your money in and out of the account in order to use it somewhere else. So I think maybe it'd be a good thing that they don't want, but they're wrong to not want it.
What's the level of with Zelle and Cash App and Venmo? You quite often hear that there is a high level of fraud and scam there, where people because the level of governance attached to those wallets isn't at the level I guess we need to have. And I think that's something that is really, really important. I think, we've seen, especially in Australia, fraud and scam, emerge, and it created what we think of as an ecosystem. And I think that's going to be more broadly, whether it's through peer-to-peer apps or whether it is a great, this ecosystem issue that involves everyone. I think that's going to be a real headwind. Like, we have to think about what we're doing as an ecosystem to win here. And I think, even though I'm really interested in your thoughts, like, I don't prescribe to the fact that we slow payments down. Like, I think fraud and scam will persist if there's a 2-hour delay or a 2-day delay or a 2-second delay. But it really is starting to think about this as an ecosystem issue, and what are we doing to lean into more governance and regulation to support the innovation and drive better outcomes. I think, what are you seeing, Reid, and is like what's the latest in the US around this?
Yeah, it's funny because one of the things later on in the show flow was about what do you think is going to be a big deal in 2024, and I think in my mind, fraud and mistake and reckoning with that is going to be a big thing that we have to do as an ecosystem. And obviously the FPC is intending to help lead that discussion. But I think what you're seeing is we're at a place where there's sort of two issues that get conflated. One issue is how do you prevent fraud from happening, right? And so there's new scam vectors that exist through instant payments that weren't necessarily how people did check fraud or card fraud, right? So banks having to understand, well, this is actually a little different. It's the receive side. It's not the customer side. So it's a different thing that they have to figure out, right? And so I think that's causing some hesitation just in terms of just general adoption and usage, right? So I think I would think that that's maybe facially obvious, but at the same time, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So it's sorry, Chris.
I sort of think about that, what you just said, that you can sort of split it into two. And the way that I guess we're thinking about it, there is, we can see disputes on the other side. So once the fraud and scam has happened, obviously consumers, some of them don't report it, but the majority do. So we can sort of get a sense of what percentage of transactions in this system are disputed. And in Australia, we've moved really progressively with the National Scam Centre. We've got the Australian Financial Crimes Exchange, which are centres that are aggregating and trying to really centre in on the concentration of scam across the ecosystem. But on the flip side, there's also, and we're subscribing more and more to this as well, is like, what are we doing on the preventative side to start to think about, as advocates, as innovators, that's great, but we also need to be leaning into this with a governance first approach of what are we thinking about to identify scams or trends or insights that can then go into preventing the next these from happening. And it's interesting, we talked, and Simone, you mentioned, like in the US, you have to be a bank. And so if you're a bank, you've got retail accounts, you've got a sense of how you risk score those accounts and the transactions and the profiles. As we move more into payment processing and innovation, you don't have a lot of those early insights, but you do still have data to be able to assess trends. And I think that over the next 12 months, at least for us, is going to be where we need to spend more time to build out controls and functions and data insights, and perhaps even use AI to really level up to help the prevention side rather than address the post-dispute side.
See, and that's the difference between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. But yeah, I do agree with you, but I do think getting a governance of some sort in place to handle the fraud that does happen, right? So you can't you want to prevent fraud as much as you can and to figure out all the good ways to stop fraud from happening. There's always going to be some fraud. And I think having a system in place where you know who is on the hook for the losses is very powerful, right? So you think about, referring back to card, right? That's one of the big values that those networks provide is, whether you like it or hate it or disagree with how it's structured, everybody knows when a card is presented at the point of sale or on e-commerce site or in a map, everybody knows the rules of the road when it comes to if this is fraudulent, how is that going to be handled? There's a chargeback, there's a dispute, there's a whole back and forth that happens, and then somebody's on the hook and everybody understands it. And I think that's very valuable in terms of the certainty that it provides to businesses, because you can still, even if you know you're going to lose some over the course of a year or whatever, what those percentages are going to be, and so you can price for that.
I think that there's another element to fraud as well that real-time payments can actually help to solve in the long term, which is the extreme spike that we're seeing in the US on first-party fraud. And there's a lot of information to say that in an inflationary environment where cost of living goes up, individuals are more prone to wanting money back, even if they know, actually, I did agree to that thing and I just forgot to unsubscribe from that thing. And I think that there's trends across both ACH and across cards that are leading towards that first-party fraud. I think that real-time payments, when they're fully embedded in the ecosystem, have the ability to bring more information and more data around the transaction that occurred to provide better quality control of which chargebacks are processed and which disputes are pursued. The other thing that I think is really interesting is something that Chris mentioned around the wallets again, Venmo, PayPal, Cash App. I think that the scar tissue that's been built up around the fraud in those systems is actually being used by some institutions that aren't on the real-time payments boat like we are, to say, oh, look, this is a space where there's a lot of fraud. It happens in real time. The fraud's going to increase. actually, to Chris's point, there's probably an opportunity to bring more rigor around who has access to that system to send requests. So, flying the flag for real-time payments there, I think there's some solves that can be brought about with them.
Yeah, and I would add to that, and Reid, you spent nearly 15 years at Walmart. Like, there's going to be brands that have huge amount of trust. So I think in Australia, superannuation, utility, some of those big brands that are synonymous with, the way of life in Australia, where if you do have a payment to the Walmart, you're not going to feel like, you're at risk of not getting your apples or things like, or whatever, if something was missed in the order. But like, I think as we start to look at the tail of embedding this, in our society, if I'm going to, buy some flowers from a florist online on the other side of the country, that's where I need to sort of understand. And I do think, like, I'm pretty progressive in my mindset as well, in terms of, I think, this is not about cannibalizing cards. I think these payment opportunities and channels exist and coexist. And there are real opportunities here to think about customer choice and providing them with that enables it. But I do think that, fraud and scam is at the moment feels like it's getting worse, not better. And I think, the level of sophistication that is now being engaged, it's unreasonable for the average person. I think about my mum, who's 83, to really understand what is real and what is not. It's hard enough for me to think about that with the tools that are emerging. So, we see ourselves, and I think the three of us probably see ourselves as stewards and custodians for what is right. And I really want to continue to think about this front and center in our mindset about what we're doing to create value in the ecosystem that compresses and puts that pressure on bad actors and bad elements. So, I think there's a lot of, and that gives me great excitement at the same time. Like, obviously, as a human, there's a human element to the impact that this is happening, which doesn't feel good. But on the flip side, as a pioneer, as a technologist, like, there's a great opportunity here to complement what we're building in the ecosystem that we're delivering.
Yeah, I totally agree. I just wanted to agree with something that Simone was saying, and that's that this is not necessarily inherently a more fraud-prone payment type than others, right? So, I mean, we talked about checks earlier. Like, what's more fraud-prone than literally handing a piece of paper around that has the account number and routing information on it? And I don't want to besmirch the reputation of other electronic payments. A lot of them are obviously members of ours, and they're super engaged and moving the industry forward. But they'll all tell you, I mean, we talked about card, right? Card, there's fraud on card. There's fraud on ACH. There's fraud through wires. There's fraud on every payment system that's ever existed. And there's no reason to think that this one is more fraud prone. It's just, it's newer, and it's going to take some time for folks to figure out what are the things we need to do to be smart about preventing fraud.
Indeed. Hey, a slight change of direction, but Reid, you'd know, of course, that the implementation of real-time payment rails don't just allow for faster payments. They tend to create an environment for new players to emerge and innovate. We've seen that in Australia with companies like Paypa and Zepto kind of emerging as dynamic, trusted, account-to-account innovators. Is that same thing happening in your neck of the woods in the US?
Yeah, I would say yes. Now, we're certainly earlier days, but we're definitely seeing, like, I had a company named Orem, who's a member of mine. Stephanie was on my podcast a couple months ago. They just announced and launched a product called Verify that's built literally to use the FedNow rail to verify account information. And so that's just one example, right? I think we're going to see so much more of that, because, like, my view is it goes beyond just use cases. It goes beyond just sort of innovating. Like, I think there will be new business models that are made possible by the existence of these rails, in the same way that new business models were made possible by the invention and proliferation of the internet and the World Wide Web 25 or 30 years ago. So, I mean, I think like, I'm super bullish on it, obviously, but I think it's almost impossible to, and if I did know what those were, I'd probably be doing a startup like you guys instead of doing what I'm doing.
So,
Simone, do you have a view on what you've seen on the ground?
Actually, I know Stephanie. She lives up the road from me, and I think Orem is a really good example of a company that has her mantra is time to money. So she's putting out in the industry that the quicker we can get cash into businesses' hands and into consumers' hands, the better. I think there's a host of companies in the US that are looking at providing the connecting bits. So if you're an organization, how do you get to access real-time payments? And what is enabling that is there's a lot more appetite in the US for financial institutions to provide services to payments companies looking to connect into payment rails. We've seen a real drought for that type of activity in Australia, and I think there's mainly one company that enables fintechs to do that. Here in the US, banks are motivated to do it because there's a commercial reason to do so. So there's a lot of middleware companies that I'm seeing popping up. The payroll companies that Reid mentioned earlier, earned wage access, so micropayments coming across as you're working your shift and having those come through. I'm seeing a lot of that. I think the automotive space, again, Reid already mentioned this, there's this real dynamic in the States where you can drive a car away and the dealer just hopes that your check doesn't bounce. And then you've got a vehicle and you know, that dynamic is driven by the dealerships run commission only. How do you actually get money verified in to let that vehicle leave the lot? And that plays out across a lot of high value industries where there's commission driven sales. So I think that's a frontier that we'll see next. Real estate, rental payments, I'm seeing a real split in the service model for independent landlords and how they're managing their properties versus large apartment blocks that are being managed by corporations that own that asset. JP Morgan has recently partnered with MasterCard to enter in to that space. They're not running a real-time payment rail yet. They're still relying on debit and ACH, but I think it's only a matter of time. I think Serena Williams is actually invested in a real estate rental property that's helping people to stay in the rental cycle as opposed to falling out. And I think real-time payments have the ability to change that as well. So that's what I think is going to happen next.
Just sticking on Stephanie at Aurum, I've listened to a lot of podcasts with her as well. Super passionate person. I think she equally may have had a financial plan or an accounting background, which has really helped her curate the outcome. But again, yeah, definitely worth a look. I think in Australia, at least from where I'm standing, and this is the same lens I bring to the US, because I try and think if we're slightly ahead of the curve here, what are we learning and taking in terms of not only providing tech to access and creating, like we all are, like a reliable, scalable product in this space. But I think the biggest challenge that we're having here as we think about the new use case, because everyone who's online now, I think everyone, you don't have to convince them that real-time payments in one way, shape or form benefits the business. So you think about any industry, any vertical, any use case, and there's a case to be made, a really compelling case that, hey, look, if we can enable a more real-time existence and customer payment experience, that's only positive. The problem we have, and I was saying again to my wife yesterday, because I was trying to get this off my chest. It's like turning up to a storage locker, opening the locker and seeing it packed to the brim and trying to think, where do you start as a large corporate or enterprise or even a smaller enterprise? You've built a business that has layers to compensate for the inefficiencies of the existing ACH or BEX as we move into this digital world. And you sort of compensate for those shortcomings by creating and, in a way, integrating to help bridge the gap on those. And so as you then think you get to a point, you've got a delayed experience that has certain, components that are sort of glued together here to compensate between internal business departments and divisions and equally through the customer experience. And you may compensate with indirect costs through customer success, people on the phone and all these things. How do you unpick that? How do you pull those layers back in a way that is not a step change where you close the door one day and you open it the next and you're in this real-time payment world? We as pioneers, as innovators, as custodians for the world we're going and we believe deeply in with a genuine belief in the value this creates, I think have to start to think about this transition and what does product look like in our services, as payment partners, like to help bridge this gap and pull apart today so that our merchants and our customers and their customers can still have a meaningful experience today that's based on real time, but perhaps still behind the scenes still have an element of legacy. And I know that sounds weird, but I think, it's a journey to sort of work through that transition to add the value so that we get to the front end or get to the new world in a way that's manageable. And And the higher up, like we talked before about the Treasury read, and government departments and agencies, that is super, super complex. Once you get into there, like there are so many complexities to how to tackle that just takes time. And I think, I would love to spend more time thinking on that transition piece, not necessarily as a consultant, but again, what are we doing that can help unlock value on the transition? Just throwing that out there.
We're actually getting close to time. So in the audience, if you do have any more questions, just pop them in. Reid, there's one here. I'm not sure if this is a short answer, if there's a short answer to this question, but it's from Richard, and it's basically around what's required to help enterprise merchants onboard or connect more easily to FedNow. It's probably also about how do you get them to overcome that inherent inertia at enterprise level to make a big change like that.
Yeah, well, I guess what I see is a lot of interest and desire from enterprise and from the merchants, right? I think that's a use case that the business end user types would love to see proliferate through instant rail. So I think the things that have to happen there are we need to figure out and make sure everybody understands the puts and takes when it comes to fraud and fraud mitigation. We need to understand how the data transfers and what data is moving in with the transaction and why, and understand the ownership of that and privacy implications associated with that. And, I think, it's not too bold to say we have to understand the economics associated with these transactions in the way that we understand the economics of other transactions. So there's a lot of things there. And then once you've done all that, then you have to get the POS vendors on the in-person side or the web interface, creators on the e-commerce side to make it actually an experience that a consumer would understand what they're doing and how to do it and feel comfortable using that instead of just using their card or whatever it might be. So, I think it's a very, very complicated thing.
On that point, Reid, what the Fed in particular has done well is publish pricing for FedNow well ahead of it rolling out so that people can start thinking about what does this mean for me, for my cost of acceptance offset with my, business efficiencies. I don't think we've done that as well in Australia. I think that's a real gap that we need to fill.
Yeah, I would just color that a little bit that the Fed is telling everybody how much they're going to charge the financial institutions, not telling anybody how much those financial institutions are going to charge their end users.
Still better. Still better.
Okay, fair enough.
I think, and just on that, I think even from our side, the deeper we're gone into, we're connected now to the MPP. That comes with a cost of being an infrastructure player and the governance around it. So sometimes as well, you anchor to this price thinking, okay, well, that's the price, but the cost to access that price is incredibly high. So, the price beyond that is different. And that's another thing that I think has not shocked me, but in the US, this idea of percentage value as a charge, like, we're used to that with a surcharge, or in Australia, percentage to use your Visa or a MasterCard. In the US, there's still an element of, to get access to real time, you're still paying a percentage of the value, maybe capped at something, but it's a different price mechanic over there. To the expectation here is account to account is materially cheaper. We're talking cents per transaction, not dollars, and certainly not a percentage of value. So trying to, again, that's a whole, can of worms there. Like, and it's hard for Australians in particular to get your head around that. But that's maybe a discussion for another day.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a whole unpacking of the attachment to interchange and how that flows through the industry and all of the things that come with that. I think it's really different to Australia.
Amazing. Hey, one final question I'd just like to kind of throw to each of you before we wrap up. It's a bit of a crystal ball. Things move fast in real-time payments and technology. Today, we've spoken a lot around use cases, fraud and scams. 12 months from now, crystal ball, what will we all be talking about in relation to real-time payments?
I can go first. I think that if you asked us this same question about use cases in 12 months' time, I think we'll be talking about things that are in market as opposed to things that are coming into market. I do. We did spend some time on fraud in this discussion, and I think we will be having a more in-depth discussion around what has gone wrong with claims management or disputes management and what we've learned from that in the 12 months. And I think that will naturally happen with volume increase. It's just a thing that we need to be prepared for. I think that from the Australian perspective, we'll be talking about a lot more long-lived case studies that do have implications for how markets like the US are learning and thinking about rolling out potentially the next phase, which is, fingers crossed, recurring payments on request to pay over there.
Chris?
Yeah, I'd add to that all of what you just said, Simone, but I'd also add in Australia, I think we will see some very big, well-known brands in market at the end of this time next year. And so the awareness and adoption around real-time payments will start to split. Now, awareness at the moment of what's possible in terms of, a capability and ability and access to real-time payments. In Australia, we're still anchored to what has been possible. And I think 12 months from now, we'll actually start to be thinking about what is possible and focusing on that. And I think that we'll start to see government departments and agencies start to engage more and more around this as well, which I think is exciting because that will also drive education and awareness of consumers for the benefits here. And
maybe a little bit flippant, but I think what I'd say is next year, this time we'll be talking about what we're going to be doing next year. So that's how we are, right? We're always, we'll spend a few minutes talking about all the, to Simone's point, about the things that we've accomplished, and most of the time talking about where are we going to go, right? Because we're at a time now where it's everything's accelerating so quickly that where we're going to be in 2025 is going to be the most interesting thing to talk about at the end of 2024. And that's not to say that we're not going to achieve great things in 2024. We are, and it's going to be phenomenal. But it's going to be the situation where 5 years from now we're going to look back. We're gonna be like, wow, a lot really happened. So that's kind of where what I would say.
Unreal. Look, I think we're going to have to leave it there. We have gone over time. Thank you, Reid, Simone, and Chris. Really appreciate the generosity of the time you've given us to take part in this chat. Super, super interesting. I know we could talk for hours. No doubt you'll hear from us again. We'll get you on for a sequel at some point down the track. So thank you everyone who tuned in as well. And look, have a fantastic end of 2023 and a brilliant start to 24. So farewell from all of us in Bentonville, Brisbane, Bangalore, and Byron Bay. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben.
Hey, I just want to add to that. I think, like, Reid, the next Faster Payments Council's in Orlando, isn't it? So
That's right.
Yeah, so all three of us will connect there as well. So, but thank you as well for Zepto. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
See ya.